All right, good afternoon. Thanks very much for coming out this afternoon on behalf of the Kellogg Institute. I am very delighted to be able to introduce Ben Phillips, who is our Hewlett Visiting Fellow in Public Policy. Ben has combined the roles of NGO director, civil society activist, and writer. He's the co-founder of the Fight Inequality Alliance, a growing movement for a more equal world. They bring together major NGOs together with social movements, rights activists, environmentalists, women's groups, faith groups, and trade unions to campaign together for action on economic and social inequality. Ben has addressed the UN on inequality. He's currently covering the world, well, currently he's here, but in his current position, he covers the world from Nairobi. He's lived and worked on 4 continents in a dozen cities and led programs and teams from Oxfam, ActionAid, Save the Children, the Children's Society, the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, and the Global Campaign for Education. He's been a resident fellow on inequality at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, was a guest lecturer on global inequality for the Cambridge University series and book on Capitalism on the Edge. He represented civil society on the Economic and Social Research Council's Global Poverty and Inequality Dynamics Research Network, and was appointed by Helen Clark to the Civil Society Advisory Committee of the UN Development Program. He's written for The Guardian, The Financial Times, The New Internationalist, and Reuters, among others, and appeared regularly on TV, including CNN, Al Jazeera, and the BBC. He wanted me to tell you that he began his development work many years ago at the grassroots as a teacher and ANC activist living in the, I'm perhaps not going to pronounce this right, Mamelodi Township in South Africa, just after the end of apartheid. For those of you on Twitter, he tweets at BenPhillips76. Ben's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A, so please hold your questions till the end, although I understand that Ben will run a couple of quizzes during his presentation. And then I will join you back up here on stage for the Q&A piece. So without further ado, please welcome Ben Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me okay? Great, good. Now, part of what makes this community, Notre Dame, so special is your commitment to the principle that learning becomes service to justice. And so my lecture today on inequality is not just in an abstract sense. It's about why winning the fight against inequality depends on you. I'm going to begin at the beginning and get a bit personal. Now, this lecture is a very personal one. I'm the one with the best haircut in the top left. But we'll traverse the world because my life has been a global one and because you're a global group too. I was born in England, where those kind of haircuts were normal. But I'm descended from the Pierce family, who those of you with Irish connections will know from the Easter Rising of 1916. And some of you hearing me will think, well, you don't sound Irish. Well, neither do you. My wife is from India, and we met in Holland. That's us at college. Now, if you're thinking, can I marry my college sweetheart? Yes, you can. So the news is good. Several countries later, we live in Kenya. This is me literally producing a hip-hop festival. This is the only time I've ever been cool. So I wanted to show you that picture. My kids are quite confused. There they are. And there's our dog. I just put our dog in because people always like you if you show your dog. Now, sometimes people say to me, how come you're so concerned about inequality? After all, you sound a bit posh. I mean, English people say that to me. Americans just think everyone from England is posh. When I was a teenager growing up in London, the cause was South Africa. Mandela had just been released from prison and was on the road to becoming president. And at a school like mine, being a Mandela supporter meant being in constant arguments with hardcore right-wing kids who saw the ANC as a threat. Now, as the arguments got more and more heated, one boy said to me, "The only reason that you stand up for Mandela is because you're never going to live in South Africa." So I said, "Yes, I am. I'm going to live there. I'm going to live there in a township." And I did, because determined young people are difficult to stop. And when I got there to Mamelodi, I discovered I was the only white person in the township. And newspapers came to look for the strange English guy. But this is the times of the time. But there, I learned something really important. My friends took me to hear Nelson Mandela speak. And as I heard him in those rallies, I realized two things. The first was, I was in the presence of a hero. But the more important thing, as I looked around that rally, I realized I was in the presence of thousands of heroes. That history had not been made by one man. History had been made when so many people organized together. Now, first quiz. This powerful quotation, which time period is it talking about in history? When the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by the happy few was so large, when the powerful were described as feeding on the powerless, when financial interests were seen as trumping the common good. When is this talking about? And who's talking about it? Sometimes people say this is Karl Marx talking about the 19th century. It's not. It's about today, and it's the Pope. Here's another quiz. Where is this? Anyone want to have a guess? Students? I'll start with students. Okay. Any other guesses? Okay. Others? Some saying Rio. Any others? Okay. Sorry? Brazil. Rio. Others? Other countries? This is good. I think you're from Sao Paulo. Because I often show this, and if somebody is from Nairobi or from Delhi or from Bangkok or Islamabad or Lagos or Joburg, they always think it's a picture of their city. Because so many cities live like this. This is the divide. 7 out of 10 people live in countries where the gap between the rich and poor is worse than it was 30 years ago. 5% of Indians own 50% of India. In the US, the richest 10% of the population captured more than all the gains made since the recession. The other 90% went backwards. So why do we need to beat inequality? Well, very briefly, I'm going to talk about why inequality is bad. I say briefly because nowadays that's quite an accepted point. Back in, say, 2012, all I would talk about was why inequality was bad. And it was still at that time very, very controversial. It was even controversial in international INGOs. Now, I remember one report that was really hard to get sign-off of. And luckily, we'd sent an advance copy to the chief economist of the Bank of England before any of our bosses knew. And the chief economist of the Bank of England wrote back saying, "This is fantastic." And I kept this report in my pocket and took it out all the time. So every time someone said, you know, we might not sign this off, I'd say, well, the chief economist of the Bank of England thinks it's good. Are you saying he doesn't understand economics, or are you saying he's too radical for you? But now it's pretty much accepted. So quickly, some of the reasons. Well, inequality harms poverty reduction. Andy Sumner at the LSE, when he did the number crunching on the 2030 poverty targets, he found that they cannot be met unless inequality falls. Inequality harms opportunity. I hear in this country about the American dream. But where is the American dream most true? Denmark. Inequality is bad economics. This is the Financial Times praising a Robin Hood economy. This is the Economist saying that inequality can be good for growth. This is the IMF saying that neoliberalism was oversold. This is from a security consultancy that I went to see. They're not making a moral point. These are people who advise governments and businesses. They're making a safety point. Inequality is dangerous. It correlates with violent crime, with murder, with the risk of political violence. You can plot on a graph inequality and the proportion of people in a country who work as guards. The more unequal is a country, the more people work as guards. It's not a sign of a healthy society. Here is Twitter and the Pope teaching us to be brief, and this is the summary of what's wrong with inequality. Now, amazingly, these points about inequality are now all accepted by all of these groups. This is pretty much a clean sweep of the establishment. And even more amazingly than that, it's been agreed by every single country in the world. In September 2015 at the UN, with the Sustainable Development Goals, every single government committed to reducing inequality. But it's not happening. This is the share of wealth held by the richest 1% in these countries. This huge concentration of wealth remains, and nothing close to the kind of action needed is being done. Now, you can write policy papers. I've written several, and here's another one that we produced in another NGO with some of the policies that set this out. And many much more erudite writers have written of the kind of policies. The problem is this. The problem is that policies are not enough. Being right is not enough. And here's one of the reasons: that you can't rely on our leaders to lead us. Would you trust these guys making this decision? So would you trust the 1% making decisions for the 99? This is one of my favorite quotes by one of America's most brilliant authors. Now I'm going to say something really mean about academics. This is what I call the evidence-based paradox. So here we go. The evidence-based paradox. We should be evidence-based in our approaches. That's point one. Point two, the evidence for change happening because decision makers have shown evidence is not great. Therefore, number three, if we're truly evidence-based, we will not depend only on evidence sharing as a strategy for change. The problem we face is the problem of political capture. Political capture means some people have so much money, they don't just buy votes, they buy elections. The new golden rule is that the people with the gold make the rules. This is set out really well in books like Dark Money or Affluence and Influence. Think of people like Carlos Slim in Mexico, or the Rupert and other super rich families in South Africa, or when President Zuma was in power, the Gupta family. Or look at how in the recent tax bill in the US, the lobby firms were literally phoning in amendments to be handwritten into the bill. So when we see that these commitments to reduce inequality are not being fulfilled, part of the answer is that these promises were not honestly made. False promises are a great tactic. Now, Gandhi said, first, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. But we could change that a little bit. We could say, and then they tell you that you've won, and only if you keep fighting might you actually win. But even when the promises were honestly meant, we can't rely on them. President L.B. Johnson wonderfully said this to Martin Luther King. He said, "I know what I have to do, but you have to make me do it." He understood the importance of pressure from below. Organizing from below is necessary not because the powerful are bad, but because they are too powerful. As Aimé Césaire said, do not seek to know whether personally these gentlemen are in good or bad faith, whether personally they have good or bad intentions, whether personally that is in the private conscience of Peter. Even the nicest of the powerful won't give us a more equal society. It will only be won by the rest of us pushing for it together. What matters is the imbalance of power. Without fixing that, we cannot fix the injustice. So let's have a look at history. How did we beat inequality before? I love history. When Tarana Burke, who set up the Me Too movement, when she came here to Notre Dame, she told me the first thing she advises people who want to bring change is read history. So if we think about how some of these spectacular changes came about for a more equal world, and we ask why, here's the answer. People organized, they built collective power, and they told a new story. Now here's another quiz. This comes from a conversation that happened at Davos. An American billionaire was asked if he could support higher marginal tax rates on the very rich. And he said no. And when he was asked why, he asked this question. Can you name a country where high marginal tax rates on the rich has worked ever? Yes, you see, the US. How embarrassing for an American billionaire to not know that. You see, from the 1930s to the 1960s, you see this period, this is when productivity meant that ordinary people made some money from it. The high rates of tax on the top were between 70 to 95%. And these were good years for growth, and growth that working people shared in. After that, under neoliberalism, you see that it's the top 1% that runs off with all the money. Extraordinary that a billionaire might have forgotten that. So, how did that happen? And let's bear in mind, this happened and stayed under Democrat and Republican presidents. And the answer to that is that people organized, from trade unions to black organizations to churches to other progressive grassroots groups. They mobilized for change. In the Venn diagram of these movements, you'll see people like Philip Randolph, the black trade unionist, who pressured both the FDR government and the Kennedy-Johnson one. And we would not remember them as such reforming presidents had it not been for that pressure. The same is true of the welfare state in Europe. Now, Scandinavian welfare state, for example, is sometimes portrayed as stemming from an essentially Nordic character, that they are innately egalitarian and gentle. In such a portrayal, they are equal because of their culture. And there's no lessons for the unfortunate rest of us who don't like ABBA. But such a portrayal is false. Until the early 20th century, there was grinding poverty and exploitation in Scandinavia. Many Americans are descended from Scandinavians who fled starvation. It was by strengthening their power that through rural collectives and through unions that small farmers and workers in Scandinavia were able to challenge the power of elites. Troops came out to beat back workers' protests and strikes. Norway's government even organized an anti-strike militia. Strikers were killed, but in the end, organizing triumphed. So what created the conditions for that compromise, that egalitarianism, that gentleness that we see as essentially Scandinavian today, was massive pressure from below, not blonde hair. Latin America in the 2000s. This picture is from some organizers I met with. The slogan on the t-shirt, I will say in the worst Portuguese possible, is Organizadas somos fortes, which I think means organized, we are powerful. The woman on the left is Dona Deje. Dona Deje is from the Quilombola community. They are the descendants of people who'd been enslaved and ran away to the forest. Now, one of the most important recent examples of significant progress in reducing inequality is Latin America from about 2000 for about a decade and a half. It was never perfect, never perfect. But in Brazil, just to take one example, one of the most unequal countries in the world, here's what the 2016 UN World Social Science Report noted. The incomes of the poorest Brazilians rose more than 5 times those of the richest. Women's incomes faster than men's. Black people's faster than whites. The impoverished Northeast faster than the rich Southeast. The richest still made more money, but the poor grew faster. And in Bolivia, even more progress was made against inequality even faster. When we look at the causes, we can't start with those governments in 2000. Yes, the policy mix was right. Redistribute land, increase incomes, organize the economy around jobs, invest in social protection for kids and the elderly, and so on. And frankly, the governments could have done more. But the interesting question is, why did they do something? Why in a region so unequal, where for decades before governments had been making inequality worse, did so many governments of the 2000s act differently? And the short answer is because ordinary people built collective power. From the landless workers' movements in Brazil to indigenous peoples' movements in Bolivia, organizing from below was the key to enabling change above. As my colleague fellow who is here to answer any difficult questions, Diego Sanchez and Corchea, did I say your name okay? Acceptable, he's smiling, thank you. One of the leading experts of this period, he titled one of his papers, "It's the Politics, Stupid." That might just have been my version, but I think that was the version he shared with everybody. And when he says it was the politics, he doesn't just mean party contestation, he means the social movements, which both generated those parties, but also pressured them. This pressure is vital because without it, there is no counter to the permanent pressure from elites. In Brazil, I sat down with those landless workers like Dona Deje, who collect coconuts from the forest and from the big estates, and they taught me about how they had successfully campaigned for a law that protects their right to do so, that goes over and above property rights. They talked about how their cooperatives had secured a guaranteed minimum price for their key products. They talked about how they had even secured in some districts free public preschool for small kids and won access to water and sanitation, which is more than people have in Flint. They told me individually, coconut breakers are small, but when we organized, we became visible. They told me, quote, everything we've achieved has been through the strength of our friendship. We got together in community, then we linked with communities across the region. We went and got support from trade unions, from the Catholic Church, and from the wider public. We started an association, and we kept pressing for our rights to earn a living and live in dignity. Now, this is Donna Dege in the middle here, meeting with a government minister, and she was demanding that in front of everybody, he signed a particular pledge, and he wanted to leave, and she just would not let him get away. And it was so powerful to see somebody, the granddaughter of slaves, who had taught herself to read in her 40s, being able to take on a government minister who was genuinely terrified of her. The Greek writer Thucydides is known as the father of history, and one of his most powerful stories he tells includes this, where a defeated faction tells the winning faction, but the quality of justice depends on the equality of power to compel. What they mean by this is that if one side has all the power and another side has none, you never get justice simply by appealing for fairness. Frederick Douglass, who had been enslaved and became a leader in the fight against slavery, noted this: if there is no struggle, there is no progress. So how will we beat inequality again? I'm going to pick out 3 lessons. The first, and this is a really hard one because we're here at Notre Dame where everybody is so well behaved. Demolish deference. You see, all these icons who today are sanitized as unchallenging were at the time terrifying to the powerful because they lacked deference. Just look at all those people who recently have been announced that they will go on the US banknotes. Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, Martin Luther King. All of them were activist troublemakers who the establishment of the time tried to crush. Marshall Gans, who worked as an organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and then with Cesar Chavez in the National Farm Workers Association, was asked by a very lovely Notre Dame student, how can we stop polarization? And Marshall replied, our work against inequality in civil rights and workers' rights was polarizing. Polarizing is not only not bad, it's essential. It is part of the journey to greater equality. And this point about demolishing deference applies also within key movements. A very sad thing to have seen in South Africa is that the ANC did not reduce economic inequality in South Africa. And part of the reason is that the constituent parts of the anti-apartheid movement, after their friends got into government, were too differential to them, too unchallenging of them. And it was the much less differential, people like Fees Must Fall and people like Treatment Action Campaign, who were the ones who were the most successful. There is always a need for challenge, even when your friends are in power. The second lesson is build power, organize. As activists have said to me, there is no justice, just us. But just us, when organized, is very powerful. Remember, though, that it takes time. The Montgomery bus boycott took a year. It was planned and it was trained for. Rosa Parks wasn't just tired. It involved churches, women's groups, and labor unions. Activists had to coordinate a massive carpool for a year, and they had to resource it from within a poor community. They had to hold huge numbers of meetings on logistics, not just on principles. And they had to fend off legal challenges and violence, but they won. I've been privileged to get to know the young Gambians who successfully mobilized in the Gambia Has Decided movement that forced that country's dictator to stand down, and the activists of the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa who mobilized students against the unaffordable costs of higher education and showed that the government can be taken on through people power. In the US, I've gotten to know the inspiring folks from the Poor People's Campaign and Fight for 15, who are organizing workers, churches, and grassroots activists and securing better pay and better services, showing that people don't have to accept society as it is. The Reverend William Barber calls these movements fusion coalitions, because their power comes from bringing so many people together. And trade unions are re-energizing and starting to organize new groups of workers. Trade unions are key. As Billy Bragg sings, who'll defend the workers who cannot organize? An interesting paper recently showed that the weaker the trade unions in a country, the worse inequality will get. Now, I say it's an interesting paper, even though it's a very obvious point. I say it's an interesting paper because the author was the IMF. All these groups, social movements, unions, NGOs, in many different countries are starting to connect across borders, across organizations. And that's the work that I've been most recently involved in with the Fight Inequality Alliance. The third lesson is to build a new story. Previous victories against inequality involve building a new story of society, and we need to again. Such a new story isn't something that we built by policy papers. This is a concert with Maiko Zulu, who is a reggae artist from Zambia. I learned in Ireland this wonderful saying: history is written by the rulers, but it's the sufferers who write the songs, and the music wins in the end. So what are some possible components of a new narrative? Well, it might say that a good society is one about the values we want to live by and about the relationships that we want to have with each other. It might say that we need a ceiling as well as a floor, and say that our society and our economy is something that we build together. In Laudato Si, the Pope has set out a vision of community over competition, of dignity over materialism. So what story could you build? Now, I was told that to conclude a lecture here at this august institution, you have to end with an important author. So luckily, my favorite author visited Notre Dame recently, and I even did a selfie with him. So here is my selfie with my favorite author, and here is the quote about how social change happens. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So it does depend on you, but it doesn't work on you alone. It works only if you're linked with others. This was the lesson learnt by civil rights activists in the US in the 1960s and is relearned by Bangladeshi garment workers today. When we demolish difference, when we build collective power, when we build a new story, we can beat inequality. It is not inevitable anywhere, but it is not impossible anywhere. I'd like to end by sharing a poem by Shelley, England's greatest poet. It was written in honor of workers who had protested and been slain, and I dedicate it today to all of you who will be the change. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Ben asked me to come up here and help moderate with Q&A, and he said a couple things. Number one, would you please keep your questions short and really questions. Number two, he'd like to prioritize students, so I'm going to try to pick students out of the audience. And number three, in the interest of inequality, he said to also pick women first. So I will try to follow those. I'm going to take 3 people at a time. We'll ask you to ask your questions, get some reflections from Ben, and then we'll go back to the audience. So who would like to start, especially students or women? Don't be shy. Okay, not a woman, but student. Yeah, and please wait for the microphone because we are recording this, so we'd like to have the questions on the video as well.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, thinking of this kind of bottom-up model of mobilization, how do you think that would work in countries such as China, where I've done a lot of research, where that type of organization isn't possible or isn't easy to do?
Hi, Ben. Thank you for your beautiful intervention. I have a question being Venezuelan. So I would like to ask you if you could reflect upon the fact about some social movements that began with a motive or discourse of social emancipation, and after being in power become authoritarian regimes, kidnapping the voice of the people. Such as, such as Nicaragua or even Maduro in Venezuela.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for coming today. I was wondering, how do you balance wanting, you mentioned the policy papers, so how do you balance wanting to publish, but also to gain recognition through publishing on projects, and then just simply starting and doing the work?
All right, we'll start with those three then, Ben.
Okay, those are all absolutely brilliant questions. So the first was about how would this work in a difficult country? And I think, I mean, every country is difficult, and many of the best examples of successful organizing started in very, very unfree conditions. So I wouldn't write it off anywhere. In the particular example of China, I think there's two very interesting parts that one could add to nuance your point. It is extremely hard in a place that is effectively governed in an authoritarian way. But there are cracks. There are always cracks through which the light comes in. One is that there are one of the reasons for some of the reflections that the Chinese Communist Party is starting to have about some social policies which need to be dealt with is actually because there's a huge amount of protests happening in China all the time. They're not called protests. They'll be called disturbances or things like that. But to give one example, if you live in a city in China, your health insurance probably says you're not really from the city, you're from the village. So when you need health insurance, it doesn't count. And they tell you to go back to the village, which you can't do because you're a migrant labor living in the city. Now, it's because of the fear of social unrest that the Chinese Communist Party is starting to look at this again and is starting to have a different attitude to internal migration because of pressure from below. So even in a country that looks incredibly stably organized in an authoritarian way, there is still effective pressure from below. I think secondly, there are some interesting meso-institutions in China, like for example, the Women's League, that on the one hand you could say are mechanisms for the government to maintain control, but are also mechanisms for people to bring different ideas and challenge. So I wouldn't give up even in that case, but I would say it is very hard in every case. Veronica's question about social movements going wrong. I think this is very common and very normal. And I think the mistake people make is this. People imagine that what we're having is a contestation for power between bad people and good people. That's not what social change needs. It's a contestation about where power should be held. Should it be in one person's hand, who we ascribe divine characteristics to, so their bad king or our wonderful hero, or neither? Should we try to shift the way that power is held so that governments always feel accountable to the public? And I think that's what often social movements have made a mistake on. They've thought that whilst they challenged the government when it was the bad guys in power, once it's their friends, they stop doing it. That's an error. And I think that loyalty to one group is a mistake. What I think we need to hold loyalty to is to each other, and to remain true, remain challenging, always. On the question of how to balance kind of, research and work and reflection, I think research is key. I mean, I'm taking out time to do research because I think research is key, because it's really hard to take on inequality. And when you look at those people who did it, you realize that they spent a lot of time studying. And there's a wonderful school in Tennessee that Rosa Parks went to learn about nonviolent organizing. This isn't an amateur hobby. It's not just a triumph of voluntarism. People look at this stuff and they try and really look at it. I think I would challenge people who are interested in how to make a fairer society to look at the how and not just the what. My brother, when he was little, he used to spend all his time writing imaginary cricket teams, the best cricket team, and he'd make these lists. He didn't have a plan for how this cricket team plan would be enacted by anybody. And I think sometimes when we write policy papers without a theory of power, without a theory of how this will become changed, then we're really just doing what my brother used to do with his cricket lists, playing. And so my challenge to those who work in the policy sphere is think about that route to influence. And if you believe in social justice, that route to influence shouldn't be because I'm mates with this powerful person. That's a very, very dangerous route to influence. The route to influence should be that you're helping a more democratic, inclusive, pluralistic conversation.
Thank you. We had a question up here and then down.
Hi, I'm Maddie. Thank you so much for your presentation and the extremely quotable bits. So I found it really interesting, your comment on the trade unions. And I am particularly interested in teaching unions. And I know in the United States that this can be a kind of sticky subject. So my question is if you have any thoughts on teaching unions specifically.
Yeah.
Mara?
You made me so happy, Ben.
Oh, you make me happy too.
Oh, Ben, I love you. My question is about the role of the university. So what should universities be doing in this whole schema, right? So we have the new Keough School, and we teach students how to work in NGOs and how to work in the state, but we don't teach them how to organize. And as you said, Rosa Parks came through the Highland School, right? And it's a skill set, right? You can learn it in desperation, but it's much better to learn all the actual skills. So what should the university be doing in terms of teaching the skills of organizing, as I've been saying a lot, and also in terms of creating other routes? So Anand Giridharadas has been talking about this in his book, Winners Take All, and in his press, about how universities perpetuate the problem by only creating opportunities for undergraduates to go off and work for the McKinseys of the world, and not creating opportunities for them to go work in labor unions, right? So what can universities be doing in these two different ways?
And one in the back.
Thank you. My name is Nzubechi for your presentation. My question is on some organizations. I didn't see you mention some NGOs or charity organizations who are working on kind of soliciting for funds or donations from people all over the world to help those communities who are marginalized as a result of the politics within those countries. So does it mean that those efforts are not really, doesn't really matter in the fight against inequality?
Right. We'll let Ben reflect on those three.
Again, these are really, really great, really great questions. So the first on teaching unions. I mean, I'm just so in awe of teachers, and especially the teachers of small children. I love my kids, and it's a nightmare to be with them for any length of time. So the people that spend more time with them are angels. But I think it's very sad how we denigrate and marginalize teachers. And when those teachers ask for decent conditions to be treated as valuable people, we think that they're useless and selfish. And that's it's a really negative and unappreciative way of seeing the difference that they make. And one of the reasons that they go on strike is because it's the only weapon they have left to try to defend quality education for the children that they love as much as their parents do. So I think teaching unions are absolutely vital. I think that it's a nightmare for any parent when a school goes on strike. Of course it is. It's a nightmare for any traveler when an airport goes on strike. But if you believe in non-violence, you can't take away all the non-violent tools people have for securing justice. I think we should stand by teaching unions, and that they do a wonderful job. And I'm just super proud of teachers, and I wish them luck. And I'm pleased to see some of them starting to win on some of these things, on holiday and on decent pay. On the role of universities, I mean, my challenge to this place, and I've said it to others, is, you know, that mural of Hesburgh and King, it is beautiful, but it's 50 years ago. So let's build a new mural. What is that mural going to have on it? And I think, you know, first you have to do the thing and then build a mural. So that's your challenge. I think there is a challenge to faculty in general and to universities in general. I think that we all have been slightly captured by a neoliberalism of the mind. So even some of the concepts we have around, for example, the business school, implies that you know, economies are built by individuals, by heroic individuals, and we know that that's not true. Finland, for example, does really well on innovation. The reason they do really well on innovation is because they invest publicly in good schools, on having good social protection. Entrepreneurs thrive in an environment like Finland or like Denmark, where if your company doesn't work, like, you don't have to risk, oh, well, then I might die from not being able to afford healthcare, or then my kids might not be able to go to good schools because all the schools are good, the healthcare is good, the university's free, the museums are beautiful and free, the transport's cheap and fantastic. So entrepreneurs can take real risks. It's not because of heroic individuals. So even some of the way subjects are taught, or how when people move from saying, we'll just make money, to think about society, they think that the best people to do that are business leaders applying business tools. And again, we know that that doesn't work. And that maybe the people that crashed the economy in 2008 and needed a massive bailout aren't the most brilliant. Just a chance. So how do universities then reflect on that and train people for leadership? This is hard because you're going to fundraise from people at the other end of the spectrum. But you know, some of them will be very thoughtful about this. One of my good friends is a multimillionaire who is he's an Iranian immigrant who grew up in Denmark. And he says beautifully, I'm not self-made, the welfare state made me. And he wants to help save the Scandinavian model and help promote fight against inequality, because he says this is how you enable more entrepreneurs like him to come about. So I think you can find those people, and I hope you can. But I would also say there's a challenge to students as well. It's never the people at the top that leads, which means in university, it will never be the faculty that leads. It'll be you. There hasn't been a single successful social movement ever in history in which students didn't play a big part. So this is your moment. The last question was about charities. And I feel this very personally, very painfully. A lot of my life has been in charities. And I think charity is great in the sense that we should react instantly. If we see someone in need, if there is a disaster happening, one of the beautiful things I once saw when I was based in Bangkok, covering the Asia region for Save the Children, and the earthquake happened in Haiti. And folks in a slum in Bangkok gave us money to spend on the response in Haiti. So people feel that instant need to respond and help, and that's a wonderful thing. We have to recognize, though, factually, that doesn't reduce inequality. It helps people get through the day, but it doesn't reduce inequality. We need to move from charity to justice. It's not to say charity is bad, it's just insufficient. Desmond Tutu, who was Archbishop in South Africa, he has a beautiful phrase. He says, when you keep seeing people floating down the river and you keep jumping in to save them, you might also one day go upstream and try stop the guy who keeps pushing them in. And I think that social justice work starts to look at that.
Great. I've got two over here and one down front, and then I'll move to this side of the room because I saw some hands over here too. So yeah, Amita, wait for the microphone, and then it's going right behind you.
Okay, I have a two-part question, so I'll keep it to one question on social movements. One is that some people who try to organize social movements want to confine it to people directly affected. For instance, Black Lives Matter may be suspicious of white people joining them, or feminist movements. You lived in South Africa, so you know you're white. So what do you think of that dynamic, and what role outsiders can play? Most people here are not poor, so Second part of that is, and this is related to the question about Venezuela, I guess, you mentioned that the struggle must go on, or protest must go on, because leadership often becomes powerful and so forth. But you didn't mention something that Gandhi, whose picture you showed, talked about how the struggle must also be internal.
Oh, yes.
So I want you to comment on that as well.
If you'll just hand it right behind you.
Sure.
Thank you. I feel the pressure to stand as well. To add a bit of diversity or variety, I'm South African and I'm Black. My question relates to how do we facilitate the strategic uptake of litigation by social movements? You've made examples of successful social movements around the world, the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa being one of them. And there are other examples. You think of Abahlali baseMjondolo in South Africa as well, and how they've used litigation. And you think of also the Soweto Electricity Committee and the Anti-Privatization Forum, etc. Many examples. And there we've seen the strategic interplay between protest and law, or what is so-called politics and law. How do we facilitate the strategic uptake of public interest litigation in that regard?
And we have one right down here on the front row, Victoria.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. That was terrific. So you tell us here a story where having an active civil society is the key to reduce inequality, right? So my question is, how do we keep high levels of activism in civil societies, right? Because what typically happens is that collective action, regardless of whether it is like a bottom-up process or a top-down process, which also happens because many times these social movements, organizations, and so on are organized and produced from above. Regardless of that, typically what happens is that you have an initial moment where people organize, they make demands to governments, they receive some sort of response or not, and then activism typically declines. Why? Because people and organizations need resources, people need time to be organized and to keep demanding for what they need and so on and so forth. And well, these are obviously challenges for organizations in general and for keeping high levels of activism. So my question is how to deal with this.
Great.
That was three.
That was three. Again, three really fantastic questions. The first was about social movements and this question of, you know, should they only be for the most oppressed? Now, just because they were named, I think it's important to say, I don't regard Black Lives Matter as an exclusivist movement at all. I know the folks who run it and they're fantastic. And I think that some of the ways in which they are maligned is some of the same ways in which Dr. King was maligned. So in the 1960s, if you look at Gallup polls, most whites thought that he was divisive. There were newspaper articles about how the March on Washington was reckless. The stuff that people say about Black Lives Matter, why can't they be like Dr. King? They're exactly like Dr. King. They are highlighting a new issue. People need to hear it. And you know, now they are lambasted. In 50 years' time, when the next group starts up, people say, why can't you be nice like Black Lives Matter were? But the point still remains, it's a really important one. Are movements only for the most oppressed? I would say no. And the reason is twofold. The first is you've got to win. And a winning majority cannot be formed by only the most oppressed. I met with indigenous people in Colombia, for example, who I think are about 1% of the population. And they talked about their route to victory being working with mestizo populations, for example, working with Afro-descendant populations, because only through them do you start to get a winnable majority. And a majority for social change isn't 50+1. Because power is roughly your money times the number of people. So remember, the people at 1% have a lot more real votes. So you need a super majority to get change. That's the first reason why I don't think movements should only be of the most oppressed. Having said that, those of us who are less oppressed need to learn followership, and that is a hard skill to learn. For me, with my passport, my color, my gender, and then working for a bunch of fancy NGOs, you know, all my tendencies went in the wrong direction, and I had to kind of be corrected on us by friends. So learning to step back is key, but that doesn't mean to step out. The second thing I'd say is, if we're looking at outsiders in the context of today's brutal inequality, outsiders are most people. So the graph of inequality isn't like this. It goes like this. Now, the very rich want there to be a divide between, say, doctors and people who are struggling for piecework. But that's where they want the divide to be. But a successful movement that establishes a decent, equal society needs doctors and people struggling for piecework in order to take on the 0.1%. So I think an inclusive movement is key. But having said that, those of us with privilege need to learn to check it. And that connects with your second point, that the struggle is individual. I mean, I have found it hard in my own life to learn that. And I have got it wrong many, many times. And that is a process of, I think we need to constantly reflect, and we need to not be upset when people call us out on it. And there seems to be a thing, for example, now in America, where people say nothing's racist unless the guy is like in a Ku Klux Klan outfit. And then even then they say he was just at university, was having a laugh. So you kind of like, at what point do we say that something's racist? I think that, for example, white people need to be able to be told by black people, what you've said is racist, without hearing, you are calling me Hitler, and without being aggro in defense. And I think that then we can learn to kind of form better and more effective alliances. The question about litigation, I think, is a really, really key one. I think it's a fantastic tool. This is where, particularly in some countries where litigation works, because the legal framework does this. South Africa is one, India's another, where you can do class action lawsuits and they can really help shift law. And this can be a great tool. I think part of it is about lawyers, progressive lawyers spending more time with social movements and learning to understand them, learning why they might think that you're a member of the establishment, why they might not want to put their confidence in you because they've seen the law be so bad to them so many times. What are the ways in which you can help to understand their language and grammar better? I would say we can never bank on litigation as the answer. So I think that you always need a strong social movement. And even where you've had legal victories, like, for example, in the US, Brown versus the Board of Education, those happen in a context of a social movement and social change. The law is not kind of immune to that, but I think it's a key aspect. And I mean, folks like you are key, and I hope that you'll be at the front of it. How to keep high levels of activity? That is the question. That is a hard one, because everybody wants that one victory. Everybody wants the heroic moment, and we don't want to know about the back end of the journey and how hard it was to make any change. But I think when you're talking about inequality, there's the double aspect. One is any social movement takes ages to be effective. The second is, the hard thing about inequality is there's no one policy that fixes it. So it's not true that you can raise the minimum wage, that fixes inequality. You change the tax system, that fixes inequality. You make new laws for women, that fixes inequality. You expand public services, that fixes inequality. None of these things are true on their own. You need to do all of them. So we need a sequence of struggles that's absolutely exhausting. And people rightly get fed up. The challenge is, if we don't keep going, then these guys bounce back, and they are always ready to bounce back. And so you just have to be eternally vigilant. I think we have to teach patience and tell the true stories of change, that they were successful, but they were very, very hard and they took ages.
All right, I have Diego over here, and I saw Paulo had his hand up and then he left, so I'm in trouble because my boss didn't get called on. But we'll start in the front row and then Diego.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation and for sharing all of your insights. So I was really interested in the evidence paradox that you talked about, and I was just wondering, as an activist and a researcher, what advice you have for us as students to maybe better understand the role of evidence and maybe reframing our research questions in the research process to promote collective action in the decision-making process.
Thank you then very much. I think we are now ready to go to do a car stoppage somewhere in South Bend and not a reception, so there's no reception. Just two very quick questions, although I would have many more. One personal, one political. To start with the personal, lessons are not only learned through what worked, but what it didn't work. Yes. So I wanted to hear, not theoretically, but in your own life as campaigner, not as a policy wonk, as campaigner, where has been your biggest disappointment, things that didn't work, and reflect a little of why you think that happened. And then politically, I want to pressure you, as I have been in the last few weeks, to tell us more about the link between the micro mobilizations and big change. Many of the things you said about the present are fantastic mobilizations that change a little, but I have strong doubts that they change the top 1%. So in a way, I'm asking you, what's the link between social movements and policy and politics? And in a way, for reasons I totally understand, you disregarded big politics and policy today. And I want to understand better how you see the link between the two and how we can structure it better, because the world is full of social movements that didn't achieve anything, even if they were very successful mobilizing, precisely because that link was never done.
And then, Holly, were you trying to raise your hand or just point out Caroline? Okay. And did I have somebody else over here? Because I was, okay.
Well, I think my question was in some way addressed by Diego. My question is, what comes after mobilization? And I mean, how do you go from I don't like this and having a large group of people rising up and saying I don't like this, I want this, to how do we get to this is what we want?
Okay.
All right. So let's go with those three.
Great, thank you. So the first, Caroline, was on the evidence paradox. I guess there's two parts to it. So one is, you could think differently about who's the evidence for. So for example, it's really helpful for a social movement or for a progressive political party or for journalists who are on your side to know what policies do work. I mean, that's incredibly helpful evidence. In some ways, it doesn't matter that the very powerful won't want to do them. It's useful for you to know. And also because they're going to gaslight you big time. So it's good for you to have confidence in yourself. So then you know what it is you're going to push for. So that's one part. The second part is to be involved in the evidence gathering of the how. So look at social movements, look at the ones that are happening today, and look at what can we learn from them and how are they doing. And I think that would be also an incredibly useful field of study, and it touches on Diego's question of the how, that the how often doesn't work. Social movements often don't succeed. To go, Diego, to your micro-macro challenge, I think we need to connect two conversations that are often separate. So there's a conversation about inequality that's held by economists and policy people and seems to miss out on the social movements. And then there's a conversation about social movements that seems to look for single issue heroic causes. It will be democracy in the Arab world, or it will be environmental change, or it will be violence against women. And it won't look at this interconnected, intersectional big picture. And I guess I would say, I want to connect two different stories. So one, if you like, is the Piketty story, Capital and that fantastic book he wrote on the state of the world. And the other is the Marshall Gans story, where he talks about how to organize. I don't think you can get to a more equal world without organizing. But I also think that organizing, to be meaningful, has to ask the question, how do you get to a more equal world? Not just how do we win one single issue moment. In terms of some things that have gone wrong, or reflections in my own life on disasters, God, I've made many. So my first heartbreak is seeing the ANC turn into a mechanism for enrichment and the maintenance of power of an oligarchy. That was so traumatizing to see. There's a story about Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril Ramaphosa used to run the Mine Workers Union. And one day he was in a difficult negotiation with Anglo American, who sort of run the country because they run the mines. And this was before the ANC got into government. They were negotiating both with the mining corporations and with the National Party government. And he was so fed up in that meeting, he said to them, "Next time I come back, I'll be your boss." And what people thought he meant was, the ANC says the land and everything under it belongs to the people. They thought that as a minister, he'd be the boss, yeah, that the mines would then be making money for the public. He actually did kind of go back as a big mining corporation guy, became one of the richest people in South Africa. He's now since become the president. I hope that he does now remember his past, because it's a tragedy to see an institution like that happen. But I think the reason why it happened, and it reflects on the discussion that Veronica raised, is that you can't ever bank on one hero. One of my friends said the thing about heroes is unless they die, they tend to disappoint. So we can't assume that there is a saint. What we have to look for is mechanisms of power in which nobody gets so powerful that they can screw you, or they will. You know, and I think that I learned. As an NGO guy, I learned about the weaknesses of NGOs. So I used to think I was really special, that I was the campaigns director of Oxfam or SAVE or ActionAid, and we were doing this big high-profile campaign, and it was front-page news in The Guardian. I was being interviewed on TV, and then you talk to people at the grassroots, and you realize you haven't made a difference at all. Because often what we were doing was getting issues into the media conversation, but that's not the same as real change. So I kind of started my work working with folks at the grassroots, and now I'm back working with folks at the grassroots, and kind of in the middle, I made a disastrous wrong turn. So, I mean, that's a lifetime of mistakes. But the serious point is, in both those examples, both in the ANC breaking my heart and in discovering the flaws in NGOs, is that you can't imagine that an elite, you know, some leftists used to talk about a vanguard. I think it's a very, very dangerous idea, that an exclusive group of people can be relied on to make society more equal. If you don't want trickle-down economics, don't have trickle-down politics. And that means we need to constantly be shifting power downwards. I can't think of anything else that works. And I think when social movements go wrong, it's when they get heroic instead of being structural. And I think we always have to be structural.
And then we had the one final question up here. What happens after?
Sorry. Okay. What comes after mobilization, and how do we? So this was about how do you? Okay, because you might just have a mobilization and then nothing happens. So I think, you know, one of the interesting points, people talk about the difference between advocacy, campaigning, mobilizing, and organizing. And I kind of, in my own life, went through all of these stages of grief to get to the answer. The first stage, advocacy, is when you think that you found the answer, you're going to go meet somebody powerful, you'll be so charming, you'll persuade them. I did a lot of that, and it didn't really make any difference. The second thing is campaigning. And that's when you think you know the answer, but you're going to spend a big budget with stunts and press releases and maybe like ask your supporters to come out, but you don't really care whether they understand it. You just want bodies. And then you think that will lead to change. And often that doesn't either. The third is mobilizing. You're still in charge. And what you're trying to do is trying to get thousands and thousands or even millions out on the street to show your strength. You've mobilized people. But change doesn't happen in a day. So the fourth is organizing. It's about the times in between. So when you look at these groups that are making a difference, you see them on the news when they're out on the streets with placards, but placards is about 1% of what they do. The key work is a series of planning, of building trust, of working with communities. It's many, many days of meetings in drafty church basements. It's endless, and it's that brings real change. There's a really good book called Twitter and Tear Gas, and it tells a really interesting story about one of the challenges of today's mobilizing. And the challenge is that it's so easy to mobilize. So in the past, if you wanted to get a huge number of people, say to the March on Washington, that Dr. King and others organized in DC, people were working on that for months and months and months to organize. It's incredibly hard. You're organizing buses, you're organizing information, it's so much logistics. Now, because of social media, you can kind of get people into, you know, say Tahrir Square in Egypt. You can get people in a few days. You just put the word out. Now, what was good about how hard it was before was that all those difficult meetings that people used to have built those bonds for a long-term struggle. Now you say to everyone, okay, let's all go protest, let's all go rally, but then you don't have a tomorrow strategy. You don't have a plan for the after. And so I think the lesson, that's a difficult lesson for people to hear, because we want to kind of, we want social change, but we want it quickly. There's a right-wing writer called P.J. O'Rourke who likes taking the mickey out of people like me. And he said, everyone wants to save the world, no one wants to help mum do the washing up, which is kind of me in a nutshell. But I think as well, you know, everybody wants to be on the protest, the famous protest, the one that's grand, the one that will be remembered, like now we remember Edmund Puttis Bridge and John Lewis. But what people don't want to be is in those long and difficult, boring meetings, and you've got to be. So I would say this is a commitment. I was told by a friend of mine, a guy called Kumi Naidu, he runs Amnesty, he used to run Greenpeace, but he started off as an anti-apartheid fighter. And he tells a story about one of his friends. I'll end with this story. And his friend later was killed by the security forces. And so kind of Kumi's been kind of motored ever since by having to live up to the legacy of his friend. So they were having a very excited conversation, him and his young friend one day. And his friend said, are you willing to give the most precious thing to the struggle? And Kumi said, yes, I am. And he said, what is it? And Kumi said, it's my life. I'm willing to give my life. And his friend said, you idiot. I'm not asking you to give your life. I'm asking you to give the rest of your life. And I think that is a much more difficult challenge. There isn't going to be a Kodak moment in this struggle. And, you know, when they write the book about who did it, who beat inequality, right? Let's imagine an author calls you up and they say to you, Caroline, we're in 2060 and inequality is now back to the kind of levels it was under Franklin Roosevelt or under Eisenhower. This is fantastic. We've escaped Reaganism. Wonderful. Caroline, how did you do it? Now, when that author calls you up, what I want you to say to that author is, it wasn't me. It was thousands of us, and it could never have been me, because change only happens together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ben. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, you still have an opportunity. We have a reception out in the Great Hall. Ben's going to hang around. Please come talk to him. And again, thank you very much for this.